Once again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to our talk today. I'm going to be talking about some recent research that I did with the Citizen Lab, not alone. This was very much a joint and collaborative project. I'll also say at the outset that because I work at a Canadian organization, a lot of this will be quite Canada-centric. Although we did draw a lot on the predictive policing, algorithmic policing scholarship, and legal advocacy that has been going on in the United States. So what this is a research project that the Citizen Lab conducted in partnership with the International Human Rights Program at the University of Toronto Law School. This was a mixed methods project where we conducted freedom of information requests, desk research, and formal research interviews under a research ethics protocol with representatives of law enforcement as well as representatives of impacted communities. In terms of what I'm going to be talking about today, first I'll give a brief overview of our report findings in terms of what are the actual algorithmic policing technologies that we found have been being used by Canadian law enforcement. Then I'll go into some specific examples of the different types of technologies we found. Then I'll move into what some of the constitutional and human rights implications are, because our report was a two-part project. The first was more of a fact-finding mission just to establish what is actually happening in Canada, who is doing what. And then the second part of the report was to actually conduct that human rights constitutional legal analysis to see what are the legal implications of these technologies and for marginalized groups in particular. And then finally, if I have time, I'll go over some of the core recommendations from our report. So to start off with, how did we define algorithmic policing technologies in our report? Because these are terms that seem to be used very broadly, variably, and potentially expansively. And we really wanted to make sure we knew what we were talking about in terms of what types of technologies to look at. So what we ended up doing was splitting it into two categories. The first are what are generally known as predictive policing technologies. I think people are starting to turn against that terminology in the literature, which we agree with, because predictive kind of implies a higher level of certainty than is actually the case. A lot of people, it's widely recognized more as a marketing term by this point by police technology vendors. However, we did use it at some points throughout the report just so people would know what we were talking about, because unfortunately, that's the term that has been popularized to date. Within predictive policing technologies, we looked at location-focused predictive policing. So that is when algorithms purport to predict the time and place of crime that may happen in the future. The second is person-focused predictive policing or algorithmic policing, and that is where we looked at technologies that focus on specific characteristics about people, whether it's their social media activity, their relationships, employment records, and then assess them for so-called risk of engaging in some sort of activity in the future. Predictive policing also includes algorithmic risk assessments, which we didn't dive into as much, but these are things like the Compass algorithm, for example, in the States is a good example of that, or sentencing or bail algorithms. The second category of technologies that we looked at we called algorithmic surveillance technologies. So they don't have that predictive component, but they are just as, if not more, dangerous to human rights and constitutional rights, we found, because of how ubiquitous they are and how unregulated they are as well. And so specifically, we looked at facial recognition, social media monitoring, automated license plate readers, and social network analysis. And these are just examples of what we found evidence was actually being used or had been used in Canada while we were working on the report. So in terms of what makes algorithmic policing different from both big data policing and traditional policing methods, it's mostly a matter of scale, also known as the three V's of big data policing, i.e. volume. The police have unprecedented access to volumes of data, whether it's through mass surveillance or through connections with other non-law enforcement government agencies or with private sector companies and private surveillance networks, for example. The next is velocity, which is you went from somebody having to manually enter data at one point in time to now data being collected, processed, and links being made in real time, potentially. And then the third, of course, is variety, is that if you imagine the types of sources of data that police had access to in the past, whether it was just what could they collect within their own means, But now that has been completely blown wide open because you not only have the data that the police themselves are able to collect, but you have the data they're able to collect from non-police government agencies and from the private sector as well, which is not even subject to the same privacy regimes. So that raises a whole host of questions there as well. In terms of, so for this next part, I'm going to go into some specific examples that we found in Canada. This first one here is our main and live example of location-focused predictive policing. So this is the GEO-dash algorithmic policing system used by the Vancouver Police Department in Vancouver, British Columbia. It is a machine learning algorithm that predicts the top 3 neighborhoods where property crime is most likely to happen every 2 hours throughout the day. The training data is based solely on cases reported by the public because they wanted to remove the apprehension of police bias. So if it was a police report of a burglary, for example, that's actually excluded from their training data. Other bias mitigation measures they use include exclusionary zones, which is if they found a neighborhood that they thought was sensitive, was potentially going to be over policed as a result of the algorithm, they actually excluded it from the algorithmic results and would go to the next neighborhood that was shown instead. And then finally, an interesting characteristic of this program is that it's a public-private partnership. So it was not an off-the-shelf technology. It was developed in collaboration between the police and academics, the private technology sector. In terms of an example of a person-focused algorithmic policing program, the Saskatchewan Police Predictive Analytics Lab is an entirely publicly funded project. So it's a joint project between the Ministry of Policing, the provincial ministries, University of Saskatchewan, and the Saskatoon Police. And what they are trying to do is use risk assessment algorithms to predict potential victims or people they consider at risk, such as missing persons or runaway youth. But we know future plans, although they're still very much in the R&D stage, eventually they want to move to trying to predict violent and repeat offenders as well. Things that they use in the training model are things like risk factors, behavior patterns, social media, and social services information. And because they were trying to be mindful of the potential bias and human rights concerns, interestingly, they made the decision to make it entirely in-house so that they wouldn't have to worry as much about things such as the algorithms being proprietary and that impacting transparency concerns, for example. Finally, in terms of the algorithmic surveillance tools that we found being used, here are some headlines that have come out over the past couple of years in Canada. Social media surveillance is a huge one. Probably social media surveillance and facial recognition were the top 2 in terms of how high profile they were, how secretive the police has been about them. Virtually all instances of facial recognition and social media surveillance that we know about in Canada, we only know because the media broke those stories through leaks or through freedom of information requests. Social media surveillance, we also know, has been used to target social movements such as Indigenous rights movements and Black Lives Matter. And of course, I'm sure people have been following what has been happening with Clearview AI and facial recognition. Even though police were using facial recognition tools even before everything broke about Clearview AI, this definitely brought that issue to the forefront. And recently, our federal privacy commissioner, in conjunction with 3 provincial privacy commissioners, issued a decision confirming that what Clearview AI did was illegal under Canadian privacy law. So in terms of the constitutional and human rights implications, this was a massive part of the report, so I'm not going to go through everything here, but I'll just quickly touch on each of these 4 main rights, which are protected in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms under our Constitution. The first one is the right to privacy, because a lot of this data collection is warrantless. And so we looked at, should these be subjected to prior judicial authorization, for example. And one of the main issues that concerned us was, in addition to sharing between police agencies, which are subjected to rules under constitutional right against unreasonable search and seizure, and then between law enforcement agencies that are not subjected to those same constitutional restraints. So what happens to that data sharing? The other element is the repurposing of data. So for example, we know that mugshot databases are used with facial recognition technology, but all of those mugshots were collected under privacy regimes that were drafted before the existence of facial recognition or before they were in wide use. So what does the law have to say about whether you can still use that data collected under the assumption of one set of circumstances now being transformed for use in this other, much more jeopardizing set of circumstances? In terms of freedom of expression, that has to do with things like loss of anonymity of the crowd. And we know that when people think that they're being spied on by governments, that leads to a chilling effect. And as you saw from the headlines, a lot of social media surveillance has been used to target social movements. So there's a particularly pernicious impact there on marginalized groups, particularly because there's a criminal code provision that bans people from concealing their faces at public protests and at riots, or what they consider riots. And so when you combine that with potential use of facial recognition, what does that mean for a right for freedom of expression and peaceful assembly? Finally, the right to equality, I think of it as almost a meta right, because every other one of the rights, if your right to privacy, liberty, freedom of expression is more violated or disproportionately violated because you are a part of a marginalized group, then that is your right to equality also being violated, because you're not receiving the same constitutional protection of your other rights over and above how algorithmic policing is also violating your right to equality in the first instance. So this is things like feedback loops of injustice that Virginia Eubanks has talked about in her amazing book, Automating Inequality. And we also looked at how socioeconomic status makes people more vulnerable to algorithmic policing, because not only if someone doesn't have a home, for example, and they're not allowed to exist indoors, then they are first more visible in public just to be searched, to be stopped, for example. But then also their data is collected in exchange for social welfare services. And so with respect to that, they are also more digitally visible as well. And then finally, our last concern with the right to liberty is the fact that under our Constitution, you cannot be constitutionally detained unless reasonable suspicion attaches to you as an individual. But what happens with algorithmic policing is that it predicts based on the neighborhood, if in the case of location-based policing. And so that is a form of generalized suspicion, but it's being used to detain and potentially arrest individuals. And so we came up with several core recommendations for our report as well, but I think I'm reaching the end of my time, so I'm going to end it there, and feel free to ask more in Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm next. Cynthia, thank you so much for that presentation. Today, I want to build on top of what Cynthia has already shown us to explore some of the human actors that are behind these tools, the politics, the history, the social context that shapes how these tools manifest on the ground. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. And today, I want to begin with a quote from Margaret Atwood, who is the author of several slightly horrifying science fiction novels, including The Handmaid's Tale. So she says, within every dystopia contains a little utopia, and every utopia contains a little dystopia. Now, I begin with this quote because it's important to remember that every technological advancement is a manifestation of someone's imagination. And in policing, it might be an imagination for safety, or an imagination of who's criminal, or even an imagination for a world without police. The point of the quote, though, is to remind you that imaginations are not at all homogeneous. That is, someone's utopia is likely someone else's dystopia. And the technologies that we build directly reflect our societal understanding of whose imagination and whose utopia is prioritized. So I begin with this quote to foreground a case in which two imaginations came into a full clash. And I think if I explain the case a little bit more, you'll be able to see that imagination often relies on long patterns of history which are not easily uprooted. So any historical project begins in the archive. So this is where I'll begin today. And though my talk will start in about 2013, together we'll travel back to at least the 1930s. All right, so what are we looking at? This is a declaration from the city administrator of Oakland, California, and it was written in 2013. It approved a $2 million grant from the federal government earmarked for anti-terrorism projects. And it would inevitably help construct what would be called the Domain Awareness Center in Oakland, California. And that's colloquially termed the DAC. So you might hear me refer to it as the DAC or the DAC. So essentially, the DAC was a really tricked out surveillance center. It was set to combine all sorts of street level surveillance cameras on storefronts, in front of shopping malls, in front of coffee shops, into one place where the police could watch and rewatch footage of any scene. It was also set to include facial recognition technologies, license plate readers, hotspot mapping, and so much more predictive policing technology. So essentially everything that Cynthia just told us about and all of the concerns that come with it. So the Oakland police chief described the project as great and a way to deter those who, without the presence of a camera, might, quote, seize the opportunity to prey on others. He also described it as a potential way to increase economic opportunity within Oakland. And this is a photo that I took while I personally was in Oakland, and you can see all of the cameras kind of capturing many different angles of the same intersection circled in the red circles. So the city council agreed and pretty much unanimously voted to approve the measure. But remember, the funds were used to build technology that were earmarked specifically for counterterrorism. But nowhere did the chief of police justify the DAC with a threat of terror. So almost immediately, Oakland residents took to the streets to demand that the construction be halted at least, though they wanted a complete deconstruction. They described the center as a police state with surveillance rather than something that would help produce a safe neighborhood where they could raise their children. And there was really good reason for concern. Not only had there never been a terrorist attack in Oakland, California, but neighboring cities like San Francisco that were at much greater risk of terrorist attacks were actually banning technologies like this. So the question for the protesters was, why Oakland? Now, it turns out that the answer is extremely complex, but race certainly had something to do with it. So here you see a map of Oakland in the 1930s, and this is no ordinary map. Some of you may be familiar already and recognize it as a redlining map, one which was used to legally enforce segregation up until about the 60s. So this redlining, for those of you who are not familiar, is the process of literally drawing a red line on a map to designate where Black Americans could live in a city. The red grade 4 area demarcated where Black people could live, while the green areas demarcated where native-born white Americans could live. And these maps were a reflection of where the best resources were in the city. While the practice was outlawed in the 60s, the legacy still exists, with the highest population of Black Americans living in Oakland today around the Lake Merritt area, which is the grade 4 red that you see on the map now. So flash forward about 80 years. This is the map of where cameras exist that feed into the DAC. And no surprise that these two maps directly adhere to one another. If you look at the comparison between the two, the DAC's surveillance cameras are an exact replica of the redlining map of the 1930s, meaning that those who are being watched are mostly Black and brown residents of Oakland. Rather than an anti-terror project, the DAC was clearly a policing technology, and it most immediately impacted Black and brown residents. And for Oakland residents, this meant that policing was not synonymous at all with public safety. So people continued to protest, and they called for the complete destruction of the DAC. And they argued both on legal and ethical grounds, because actually what they found when they started arguing for privacy, using Fourth Amendment protections against warrantless search and seizure, was that the DAC was very legal. In short, because cameras were capturing all sorts of movement in public, as Cynthia mentioned, this was actually not an illegal practice. So the DAC was technically constitutional. So they argued not only that the construction violated privacy, but also that the contractors were operating illegally. They were military contractors that were operating on protected land in Oakland. And also that the process was anti-democratic, because essentially the city council only asked one question, more in jest rather than earnest, when the contract was presented. They asked, "We won't be looking into people's living rooms, will we?" and laughed. So the protesters wrote op-eds, they stood outside City Hall in this photo, and in many other instances. And over 500 residents attended multiple city council meetings and gave testimony about why they did not want this construction. And finally, in 2015, they were granted a residence council on privacy. And while this was closer to what the protesters wanted, it was in no way their abolitionist imagination for the future. For them, privacy was only the tip of a very large iceberg about complaints about a system, especially in a city where Oakland police regularly did things that were really unconstitutional and really unethical. So I end again with Atwood, who reminds us to consider how utopias and dystopias are intertwined and in many ways inseparable. And when we analyze technologies of any sort, but especially those of policing, we should really ask, whose imagination is it? And whose imagination, whose utopia is being manifested? And finally, what can we do to ensure that those who have less power have the opportunity to put forth their own imaginations? So I'll end it here, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Thank you so much. So we have one additional speaker, and we are so glad that they are here today. So we have Samuel Sinyangwe. They are a policy analyst and data scientist focused on ending racism and police violence in America. Sam has supported movement activists across the country to collect and use data as a tool for fighting police violence by building Mapping Police Violence, the nation's most comprehensive database of killings by police. Sam also co-founded Campaign Zero, a national research and advocacy organization that partners with local organizers to enact legislation to end police violence. Previously, Sam worked at PolicyLink to support communities in building cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families. He's a graduate from Stanford in 2012. Sam, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely, it's good to be here. So I will do a couple of brief remarks just to give you an overview of some of the work that I've done in this space. And it's a little bit different from I think some of the approaches that have been mentioned to date, but complementary. So, as has been said, I got into this work in the context of the national uprising against police violence that began in Ferguson in 2014 and became sort of enveloped the country and the world in 2015 and 16 and still reverberating to this day in the political consciousness and the political discussion. And at that time, there was very little data, right? So the police had all of this data. They were building out predictive policing algorithms. They were collecting all kinds of information they shouldn't be collecting on people, violating people's privacies, building all of these surveillance systems and cameras. In some places, they were beginning to pilot drones. So in like Baltimore, you had a surveillance plane that just circled the city, capturing images of every person doing every single thing outside. But when it came to time to examine the behavior of the police, to understand police violence and police misconduct, suddenly there was no data, right? So in 2014 and early 2015, so much of the national conversation was actually about the absence of data when it comes to understanding police violence and understanding the behavior of the police. The federal government, even to this day, does not collect comprehensive data on people killed by the police, let alone other forms of police violence that are much more frequent. And so literally we had to build this database from scratch. And that's sort of how I got into this work, using big data, using technology to actually collect data on the police that the police weren't willing to report themselves. And so that process led to the construction of Mapping Police Violence. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data collection work, and then also some of the organizing and advocacy work, using data as a tool to better understand and address police violence. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So in 2014 and early 2015, there was very little data. There were a lot of, it was a nationwide conversation trying to figure out what's the scale of police violence in this country? How many people are killed by the police? How many people are otherwise harmed by the police? Where are the places in which this issue is most severe? Where are the places that are making progress? We need to know all of those things to better understand solutions, to better understand and align organizing around the data, et cetera. And so that led to the construction of Mapping Police Violence through a system of Google alerts where we're actually able to track through media reports of police shootings, other police use of force incidents through keywords like officer-involved shooting, et cetera, and leveraging other crowdsourced efforts like Fatal Encounters, the Malcolm X Grassroots Project that had laid a foundation for how to collect this information, even when the police would not report it to the federal government. We're able to build this database, right? And this database showed that there were about 1,100 people killed by the police every single year. Now we have data from 2013 all the way through the present, actually, so we have 2020 as well. And what you see in the data is that there are about 1,100 people killed by the police every single year. There are still cases that go unreported, right? So this isn't 100% of all of the cases. This is probably about 95% based on the best research estimates, and happy to talk more about sort of the analysis behind that. There remain cases that are not included in any database. They're not included in the federal database. They're not included in any crowdsourced database. Those tend to be cases in more rural areas, in areas that don't have media infrastructure to report the cases, in indigenous communities. So we know that there are gaps in the data. It's important to mention that as we go into the analysis to know what we're missing. But here's what we know, right? So I think part of what is interesting about this is that we start off in a place where we had very little data on police violence and police use of force across the country. And now we have much more data than we had back then. It's been about 6 years of research, not only by us, but by organizers across the country, researchers, academics, journalists. And we're able to better understand the landscape of police violence and how it's changing, and also better able to understand the solutions. So the first thing that we know is that there's been a pretty constant rate of fatal police violence year over year, and even day over day. So you can see the calendar for 2020 here. Literally every single day, there are an average of between 3 and 4 people killed by the police. We also know that for every person fatally shot by police, there are approximately 2 people who are shot by police and survive. And it's much more difficult to get that data. But ultimately, what we're able to see now are that there are some shifts in the landscape of police violence that have been happening over the years. And some of those shifts offer clues in terms of what might be working to reduce police violence and hold the police accountable. So we know that there's been a shift when we talk about geography, that fewer people are being killed in big cities now than were being killed by police in 2013 and 2014. It's been about a 30% reduction from 2013 to 2019 in big cities, and that more people are being killed by the police in suburban and rural communities. So the geography of police violence is shifting. We also know more about the places in which police violence, fatal police violence, is happening at higher and lower rates. Particularly that there are a set of cities that consistently year over year demonstrate higher rates of killings by the police, higher rates of police shootings in general, fatal and non-fatal, higher rates of police use of force, not including firearm. Consistently year over year have bad outcomes, the worst outcomes in the country. Places like St. Louis, Orlando, Florida, Phoenix, Spokane, Bakersfield, Tulsa, consistently year over year have some of the worst outcomes in the country. And what we can also see are some of the places in which the outcomes are not as bad as those outcomes. So Irvine, California, the 100 largest cities in the country, Irvine, California is the only city in which nobody had been killed by the police from 2013 to the present. And that there were a set of other cities that had much lower rates than the national average. Places like Detroit, Newark, even New York City had much lower rates than the national average. And that there were places that had made substantial changes over time, right? So you look at a place like Oakland, right? Oakland continues to have a whole bunch of problems in policing. Racial disparities continue to be off the charts, right? We fundamentally need to transform policing in Oakland. There have been some changes with regard to deadly force in Oakland, though, over the years. So when you look at the actual number of police shootings, this is both fatal and non-fatal, year over year in Oakland, this is what that looks like from 2005 through 2019. You see a pretty substantial reduction, right? So it's about 90% the reduction in police shootings on average year over year in Oakland since 2005. And that's not the only city. So you look at Baltimore, you look at Chicago, you even look at New York City, you see substantial reductions year over year in police shootings and killings by police. In Chicago, it's over 70% reduction. In Baltimore, it's over 50%. New York City is similar. So these are pretty substantial reductions that are sort of going under the radar. They don't make it into the national conversation, national discourse, But what they indicate is that if a city can reduce police shootings by 90% in this time period, then there should be no problem with replicating that across the country if we can deconstruct how they did it in these cities, what the organizers did to push cities to adopting changes that resulted in these reductions. Then conceivably we could dramatically reduce police violence nationwide by scaling this up. So I think data helps us better understand and provides a set of questions that we can start asking to better understand not only sort of why this was happening, because I think we sort of get it now, but more importantly, like how we can actually address it. The other piece I wanted to go into is this idea of like predictive policing and how that might actually be able to be flipped on the police. And this is sort of controversial, so I hope we get into this in the moderated conversation. But we know that predictive policing is incredibly problematic. It is biased. It reinforces racism in policing. It leads to more police being sent into Black and brown communities and more people being incarcerated. At the same time, there is an emerging sort of body of research that suggests while that approach is incredibly problematic, doesn't work in the space of addressing sort of community safety, you can actually start to use data on police misconduct to predict which officers and which departments will shoot somebody next, will use force against people at higher rates, will commit misconduct, will be named in misconduct complaints, will be sued for misconduct down the road. So there is sort of this emerging field running in parallel, which suggests that we could actually flip predictive policing on the police. Use it to better remove officers that are at the highest risk of using force in the future, use it to identify which departments need an immediate intervention, either locally, state, or federal through, like, for example, the Department of Justice intervening through an investigation, the state attorney general intervening through an investigation, or the city intervening through policy and practice changes. And so you may be familiar with the research of the Invisible Institute, for example, which has really spearheaded some of this work in collaboration with the University of Chicago. They got access to 17 years of data, actually 18 years of data on the Chicago Police Department, on about 30,000 officers over this huge time frame. They got access to every use of force incident. They got access to every misconduct complaint that was reported, and even every lawsuit against the police. And they got it by officer name. And so they were able to construct this visualization, which basically shows, that you can begin to map out the concentration of police violence within particular agencies, within the agency, even within units and divisions within the agency. And what they were able to show, more importantly, was that officers who are in closer proximity to officers who have much higher rates of misconduct and use of force begin to exhibit those same tendencies. So there is essentially what that means is we can start to contact trace police violence like you could contact trace coronavirus, where if you are exposed to an officer who is one of these officers that has much higher rates of misconduct, you are then more likely down the line, and according to their research, about 5 times more likely as an officer to shoot somebody, 4 times more likely to use force, and 9 times more likely to be named in a misconduct complaint if you are in proximity to one of these other officers. So, what this suggests is that we can think about this issue in a complicated way and begin to use some of these tools and algorithms actually to investigate the police rather than to sort of weaponize those tools against communities. To that point, there's a lot more data now that we can use to fit into these systems. So for example, and I'm gonna pull up a different analysis here. So one of the things that we're able to do in California, because of legislation called the Racial Identity Profiling Act, every single stop made by the police is required to be reported to the state. The state maintains this database of all of the stops and all of the actions that police reported making during the stops. So whether they used force, whether they searched somebody, whether they arrested somebody, if so, for what, whether they found anything if they searched somebody, et cetera. Now, that stops data is just now being published by the state for the 15 largest agencies in the state, and then next year for every agency. And so now we can start to map this out at an incredibly granular level, even at like the street level, the block level, to understand where the police are using force, where the police are committing misconduct, where the police have the highest racial disparities in conduct, to think about holding them accountable for those actions. We could think about having observers there in those locations on those blocks. We could think about folks organizing in community, having access to this data to better be able to send folks, cop watch folks, community oversight folks to those areas to hold those officers accountable. So this is what that looks like in San Diego. So this is an analysis of all of the stops reported by police over a 1 year period, for half of 2018 and the second half of 2018, first half of 2019. That full year of stops, there were over 100,000 stops made by San Diego Police Department. And you can actually, map this out incredibly granularly. This is actually color coded by the race of the person stopped. So you can even see that, almost everybody stopped as Black or brown. And you can begin to even map out where are the, you could even use the term like the hotspots of police violence, right? So we can map this out in a grid format. I mean, this is like what the police use against us, but we can actually use this to map out where the police are most likely to stop people at higher rates, where the racial disparities are most severe. We could map out where they use force at the highest rates and organize at this level of granularity. So I say all of that to say, I think that this field is sort of evolving pretty rapidly. And we do spend a lot of time necessarily focused on how the police are sort of taking these technologies and tools and weaponizing them, particularly against Black and brown communities, which we absolutely have to stop. And at the same time, I think we should be creative and innovative in thinking about how we can use some of these technologies to actually better hold the police accountable, to expose practices that weren't exposed before, to strengthen the ability of community oversight structures and regulators and legislators to step in, and to do things a little bit differently. The last piece of this that I think is notable is thinking about the role of like how we are engaging proactively communities that are most impacted by policing and centering their voices, centering their priorities and demands in the approaches that are being taken at the policymaking tables. And so one of the things that has been interesting to think about is how we might be able to utilize technologies in the digital ad space, Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, and digital ad targeting to actually reach people who are directly impacted by policing and integrate them into those advocacy efforts. So for example, in Florida, in collaboration with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in 2018, I led a digital ad campaign that actually focusing on sending digital ads to people who had felony convictions in the state of Florida to let them know that this amendment was going to be on the ballot that would restore their right to vote if it passes. And what we were able to do was take some of these criminal justice data sets, take some of the data that is actually like all too public, right? If you have an arrest record, if you have a criminal record in Florida, it is all public. The police just publish the data, right? Which is incredibly problematic. We should get into like the use of mugshots, the use of people's privacy being violated, et cetera. But what was interesting about this is because that data was public, what we were able to do was actually make sure that everybody on that list who logged into Facebook or Instagram would see these ads, would know this was on the ballot, and actually were able to increase turnout in Florida. And that initiative did pass, restoring voting rights over 1 million people, in part because folks who were directly impacted, there was an intentional strategy, not only sort of at the digital space, but also on the ground in the canvassing and volunteering, et cetera, to center the folks who were directly impacted by these issues, and to have an explicit focus on engaging, empowering, and integrating those communities into the advocacy work, the outreach work, and just the work of enlisting people in your own families and communities to turn out to vote. So much of these technologies, could actually be used in the space of, for example, finding information on police misconduct that goes unreported. So in Oakland, we did a similar digital ad campaign that focused on people who had recently been arrested by Oakland Police Department. And we were able to more than double the number of reports of police misconduct in the city during the time period of our analysis by proactively engaging folks who were most likely to have had experienced police misconduct, rather than sort of waiting on people to figure out how to navigate these complex bureaucracies to submit a complaint. So I think that there's a lot that we can actually do in the space of using technology proactively to hold the police accountable, to center folks in the conversation about what solutions should look like, and ultimately to help us understand the data landscape of police violence as we think about solutions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we are going to start to move to questions. As a moderator, I get probably first dibs at those. So that's exciting for me. I feel like all these three presentations really complement each other so well. I think for those folks that are here because they're policing scholars or they're interested in racial justice, I was wondering if we could maybe just say very clearly, how are there biases in these algorithms? I think that's one of the, sociologists, there's a famous text called by Porter that's called Trust in Numbers. So we think of numbers as being objective. So how is it possible that there could be biases rooted in numbers? Isn't it supposed to take away discretion? So just on that surface level, maybe each of you can kind of speak to where the biases can happen if this was supposed to take away discretion.
Well, I think there are two elements to it. The first is that even though algorithms purportedly are made of math and science, I think at the end of the day, what people forget who put forward that argument is that algorithms are still created by humans at the end of the day, and humans are always fallible. And so there are several specific sources of bias that we can point to, though, when it comes to algorithmic policing. The first one is the data itself, because the output is only as good as the data will ever be, whether it's the training data or the input data. And one of the things that we did in our report was we have a section where we looked at all the common sources of police data that could be fed into a training or to a predictive algorithm. And so that includes things like so-called gang databases, mugshot databases, police or arrest records, carding. So I think that might be the Canadian equivalent of stop and frisk, where in Toronto, for example, there have been multiple studies and inquiries into a police practice of carding, where mostly Black and brown young men are stopped on the street, and then their information is written down onto little cards that are then filed into police databases, even if there is no basis for the stop whatsoever. And so we looked through at each of these types of data, and every single one of them was inaccurate, was biased. And so we don't know if non-biased data actually exists, because when you look at the history of the criminal justice system, both in the Canada and the US, and the history of colonialism and systemic racism that just pervades the system since the beginning of their existence, we're not sure where you would even get this so-called unbiased data that you could build these policing systems on in the first place. And then the second, even assuming that you did have somehow perfect algorithms with perfect data, then you have to look at the application of them. One of my favorite projects that I've seen is something called the white collar crime heat map. Mm-hmm. I think it's the New Inquirer, I want to say, where they made a white collar crime heat map that just looks at downtown Manhattan. So why are no venture capitalists rushing to build that?
Cierra or Samuel, do you want to give us some insight on that as well?
Sure, I'll add on here. I completely agree with everything that Cynthia just said, but I'll also just note that even before algorithms, there was lots of statistical analysis about crime and crime analysis that was based on data that was really heavily biased in many ways. And Khalil Muhammad has this great book, Condemnation of Blackness, which explores essentially how crime statistics arose only to capture crimes of Black and brown Americans and not to capture at all any crimes of white Americans. And he goes through a history of how systemically data actually left white crime out of the equation. So this goes way beyond algorithms, way beyond any sort of technological fix, and really to the deep roots, as Cynthia was mentioning, of the criminal justice system itself.
Sam, do you want to take that, or should we move on to maybe more of the policing side of it? Or
yeah, I mean, I think everything has been covered. I can't improve this on this at all.
Well, I guess I just wanted to do a thought experiment. I thought a lot about the idea of hotspots, right? Where we're in some ways taking neighborhoods and labeling them as quote unquote crime hotspots. And I always say to my students, why don't we call them high victimization spots, right? Where we'd swarm the neighborhoods where the people need the most protection, right? So sometimes the logics are about hunting people, criminals, right? Which inevitably seems to be Black and brown communities, rather than protecting. And so can you talk a little bit about the logics on the ground? Like when we take these numbers and then use predictive policing and call neighborhoods hotspots, is there any logics of victimization there? Because by I'm thinking in Oakland, this might be a place, if you live there, you might have certain fears, but you also might also fear the police and not want to call them. So if we can talk about the other side is about victimization and how we can think about these neighborhoods or the hotspots in different ways, perhaps.
So I think, to your point, one of the things that really does stand out in the research is the connection, this sort of false dichotomy between sort of offender and victim, right? And how many of the people who are labeled as quote unquote offenders are actually themselves victims of a whole host of things, systems, et cetera. So, many people, one of the predictors that is used in many places to understand by the police to understand who is at risk of potentially shooting somebody is whether or not they themselves have been victimized by gun violence. So they're literally using these algorithms that use victimization as a proxy to understand who they should be further victimizing as the police, right? And I think that is, to your point, it compounds the problem rather than addresses it. And so, to your point, we should be thinking about making investments in the communities that are hurting, have been traumatized by the police and a whole host of systems for generations. And that should actually be how we think about making investments in what people need rather than further investments in the police. I think that's what we've seen across the country is just a call to recognize that all of this money is going to the police right now. And that money would be so much better spent invested in communities. So you look at a place like Oakland, the Anti-Police Terror Project just released a report where they showed only about 4% of the amount of time that police spend responding to calls for service in Oakland involves responding to violent crime, 4%. And again, even that is, when you dive into what the police are responding to, how they're responding, whether they're actually solving a problem, the answer is usually no. And so, there's a whole host of investments that should be made in these same communities that frankly, the money should be reallocated from the police, right? So we've seen programs that have begun to be piloted that offer us some clues into what some of those alternatives might look like. So there's the STAR program in Denver, where they just found that after a pilot program, they responded to something like 748 calls for service involving mental health crises. They responded to each one successfully, effectively. They didn't have to call in the police for backup. There was nobody being arrested. There was no force being used. So that shows that we can respond to those situations in a completely different way, sending mental health clinicians rather than police officers to the scene. And so I think part of this is, to your point, flipping this paradigm and recognizing that there are more calls for service in communities that have more need, right? That have higher rates of poverty, higher rates of inequity, and that the response shouldn't be the police, but we can nevertheless look at that data and think about, we do need a response. We do need to make investments. This does tell us that there is need, but that doesn't tell us that we need more police.
Yeah, I'll jump in here as well. I think the story of the Oakland protesters kind of makes very clear that there's a difference between public safety and policing. I spent lots of time looking through videos of these testimonies that they gave at City Hall. And one of the things that came up over and over is we don't need more police. We want more parks, or we want you to give more money to schools, things that would strengthen the community, things that would make people feel safer, because police didn't make them feel safer. And there are tons of sociological work now that's coming out, which I'm really excited about, that kind of separates policing and public safety and highlights that there's often this tension. Many communities that are over-policed are under-protected. And so when you have a really high concentration of police, it doesn't actually mean that problems are getting solved in the ways that you want. Victor Rios is one sociologist who does this. I believe he's a sociologist. I'm not certain about that though. But Victor Rios writes about the many ways in which communities of color are actively policed, but when a resident will go up to a police officer and ask for, say, directions or help with something, they'll just turn a blind eye. And so to really highlight what Samuel was saying, these communities need more than policing, and policing is often not the solution to the problems that we're seeing here.
Well, and just to that point, sociologist Robert Vargas has a book called Wounded City. It's about Chicago and violence. And one of the most striking kind of findings in that study is he would look at the same neighborhood and he would look at how a neighborhood was gerrymandered. So that one side of the street of the same neighborhood was represented by one alderman. And the other side was represented by a different alderman. And that gave different resources to different sides of the street. And you could see differences in crime on one side of the street versus another, right? And that to me is such a strong argument against any type of idea that there are toxic cultures of residents, or there's a toxic neighborhood, or any of the racist tropes about cultural deficiencies that cause crime, right? These are the same types of people, and they're all lower income, and yet you see different outcomes based on resource allocation that has to do with violence prevention, resources, other things, and many of them do not have to do with the police nor the types of people that live there. And I think, in that book, he also talks about, grandmothers, witnesses, identifying gang members that have committed a crime, and rather than protecting them, there are these string of arsons that erupt after people participate, so that the police, once they get cooperation from community members, they don't then offer that same protection. And so those folks end up being victimized. So there really is this much larger picture about, being seen as a victim who needs service. I wanted to talk a little bit, bring some of these questions in from the audience. We have so many coming in. I encourage, it's hard with these webinars. We can't see all of you, but the Q&A is the fun way that we get to interact. Allison asked all the speakers, can you speak to deaths in custody in general, and how do technology affects prisoners' rights? And I know a little bit about this, but I'm wondering what you all know.
So I can talk about the data collection around deaths in custody and police violence. So first of all, there is a Deaths in Custody Reporting Act. It is not the best. So there is legislation that is supposed to collect data on deaths in custody across the country. The legislation expired a decade ago, went out of effect. It was reauthorized. I think last year is the first year of the new data collection for it. But that program has, just like the other programs that are trying to collect data on police violence, it underreports deaths in custody. It misses a number of cases. The most comprehensive analysis that I've seen on deaths in custody is actually done by the media. Reuters just released an analysis with several years of data of deaths in jails across the country. And that's often the hardest to get because each county has its own systems, data collection, et cetera. There are, I think, 3,000 counties across the country. So it really is a Herculean effort to collect this data at the county level. Prisons, there's better data on just because it's managed at the state level. You have the 50 states. It's a little bit easier to manage the data collection around it. But there continue to be huge gaps in our knowledge of in custody deaths. And however, based on the data that has been reported, we can nevertheless begin to identify places that are outliers, right? And what is interesting about this is now we have many different types of data to understand policing behavior that we didn't have before. So we have data on killings by police in the process of making an arrest. We have data on some data on in custody deaths. We have data on police budgets now, number of officers on the force, a little bit of data on accountability, civilian complaints, data on arrest practices and disparities. And when you look at this sort of holistically, you look at all of these different outcomes in conversation with one another, you see that there are places like St. Louis, places like Orlando, places like Baton Rouge, which consistently across indicators have the worst outcomes, right? So you have St. Louis, for example, the St. Louis area has not only the highest rate of killings by police sort of outside the custody setting or outside of jails and prisons, but also in the context of the jails has among the highest rates of in custody deaths. And so those are connected, right? That tells us that this sort of toxic, racist police culture is across a variety of different systems in the same area. And I think that is also something that to understand. And there's research showing that actually taking the map of police violence data, Boston University researchers looked at the relationship between places that had higher rates of police violence and residential segregation and other indicators of structural racism. And they found that there was a connection there, that the places that had more structural racism had more residential segregation. You're going to this conversation around redlining, right? That those places had higher rates of police violence and worse racial disparities in policing. So these things are all sort of connected across systems, and we can better understand, while we talk about the police, oftentimes are emblematic of something that is sort of pervasive within a variety of systems that are all touching the same communities and families and causing harm in multiple different ways.
Absolutely. Anybody else have any insight as to prisons and jails?
So I guess I should say first off, no, but I will use that as a jump off point to the reason that I can't speak to that as much is because our report focused explicitly on the predictive, so-called predictive element. And I think it's important to highlight that because so much of what happens in the predictive policing sphere of what algorithmic policing tools are marketed to be doing is if you think about the kind of stages of the criminal justice system through which someone would be put through once they are entered into the system, you have initial contact with police, possible detention, arrest. And then at that point, maybe you get charged, maybe bail sentencing, and then only in that final stage are you in corrections and parole. And our entire report focuses just in that almost like even before you enter into that process. And that's partly why these technologies are so dangerous, because one of the things that we saw, this was not new research on our part, this was years and years of inquiries and commissioned studies showing in Canada that at every single one of those stages, arrest, detention, whatever, historically marginalized people, particularly Black and Indigenous people, are disproportionately criminalized. They are treated more poorly, they are treated more harshly, and are disproportionately overrepresented because of that systemic discrimination at every one of those stages. So it's tremendous snowballing effect. And so that's why some people will say, well, why is it such a big deal if a police officer stops to talk to you on the street for no reason based on your race, as if that's not already a problem. But say that happens, you're now on that little card, you're now entered into the database. And so you are more likely to come up in future searches if something happens. And then that just snowballs into every subsequent stage. And so that's why it's important to nip in the bud and look at how people get entered into these systems in the very first place.
And Cynthia, that's a great point. I know on the chat right now, Tom Grover had asked something very similar, which is database on reported stops. It says, what happens to the unreported stops? So you're saying that if the police officer stops, there's an encounter, where does that data go? If there is no arrest and they just let you go because there was no reason to stop you or keep you?
Yeah, well, in some jurisdictions, we know they still keep the data on file, so it doesn't get expunged, even if it doesn't lead to anything.
Right. And that is the troubling. I mean, so my own research is, really in dialogue with this, which is, when I was in the criminal courts researching for my book, in the late 90s, early aughts, they began swabbing people and taking their DNA and then matching with an IR number, which was your prison number or your jail number. And that number would track with you and keep you in the system. You were there forever, really. And it was interesting when I was researching the second book about the Cook County Jail, to visit someone in jail, you had to provide all your information. You couldn't just, like, if your relative's arrested, you can't just go see them. Like, you think that people think you can just go see them. Depending on the jurisdiction, that is not possible. But it also means you have to surrender all your information to the sheriff's department. And what was unclear is what they were doing with it. As a skeptic, as someone who studies these things, my sense was, my guess is they've now mapped the incarcerated person or the person accused of a crime, not convicted, but they're also able to now map every one of their friends, relatives, anybody who comes to give them support of whatever type. So that to me was like, to your point, Cynthia, this kind of pervasive web, it's going in every direction, right? That it is a map basically of the lowest income, mostly marginalized community, all in Chicago. I would think. I mean, I don't know.
Just to build on Cynthia's point, there are now algorithmic tools kind of scattered throughout that entire process with the criminal justice system. And oftentimes they're heralded as these things that are supposed to be solutions to problems that we used to have. So for example, pretrial risk assessments are heralded as a solution to cash bail, which many people know is one of the things that marginalizes people from low income backgrounds because they can't pay cash bail. So they put these pretrial risk assessments in place, for example. But if you look at the variables that they include in the models, things like, do you pay rent? Do you own a cell phone? Are you married? What's your level of education? They also directly map onto many of the systemic injustices that we have in the country today. So it flows all the way through, and those things allocate people to prison that determines whether or not you stay in prison to await your trial.
Absolutely. And I think we think their discretion is not part of that, but my colleague and I, Armando Larmian, who's at Berkeley, we looked at discretion when the sheriffs implement these decisions, and they're using these algorithmic tools, or these risk assessment tools, I should say, and they're downgrading people. They have an override category where they're able to say, oh, domestic violence, that's not a big deal. This guy, you know, he comes from a dysfunctional family. I'm letting him go. So you think on the surface, it seems like, wait a second, you're releasing someone from jail. So on the surface, that's good. But on the other side of it, they might return to a partner where they might actually commit violence, right? And so it can work in both directions, either to hold somebody inappropriately, as you described, Cierra, or to let a person that might be violent go out and victimize somebody, especially a Black or Latinx person. And so again, in both directions. We have more questions here for Cierra, specifically from Corey Williams. I'd love to know specifically how governments improve public safety in terms of that separation you mentioned between public safety and policing.
This is an excellent question, and it's an ongoing question for governments around the world. I mean, this summer was a time of reckoning for lots of different cities. This past summer in 2020, with all of the Black Lives Matter protests, and so the short answer is that we have no good solutions yet. It's something that we're consistently working on. And I'd love to hear if the other panelists have good models of governance. At the moment, where I am right now, Boston, they had a police reform bill, and that kind of drew heavily from lots of community members, but it's still not exactly what people want. One of the main things that I can say, though, is exactly what Samuel mentioned at the very end of his presentation, which is to make sure you get community member input. One of the things that Oakland residents were really frustrated by was that the city council kind of unanimously decided this thing about their lives that they never got to even talk about. And when they did talk about it, when they did exercise their democratic rights in city hall meetings, for example, they were pretty much ignored. Mm-hmm. And so how do we build processes of democratic governance into our understanding of policing? How do we include community members in our decisions about these things? It's an open question and something that's still ongoing.
You know, I want to turn to a question for Rachel N. And I don't know who Rachel N is, but I actually was thinking along the same lines of what Rachel is saying. So I'll read it to the group here. It says, with this idea of using predictive policing against the police, two concerns come to mind. One is about validating this approach, which, as you say, has led to terrible impact in other contexts, but also what does the oversell, does that oversell the complexity bit? Do we really need a fancy algorithm to tell us that that places which have higher than average misconduct or incidents of shooting are likely to continue with such problems? And I was going to add to this too. I want to add to this question. I'm going to throw it back at Sam, big fireball. We know the names of these people. I'm going to just be straight up honest. In fact, I picked my favorite person. I typed into the Citizens Data Project. You too can play at home. The link was put in the chat. I queried John Catazara. And if you are from Chicago or focus on him, he is the union president elected by a majority of police officers. So Sam, you had showed the clusters of how, like a disease, this culture of violence and misconduct can spread as a type of policing. But I'm going to push back for a second and say that a majority of police officers elected this person. Now, the power of this Citizens Data Project, where I shout out to Jamie Calvin, the journalist that was part of the FOIA and the suing to get this data to the public. You know, the only reason we know this is because of his work and his group. 50 allegations against John Catazara. 10 were sustained and 9 were disciplined. 5 were for use of force. He's a high overachiever at the 99th percentile of all officers in the city of Chicago. And he makes close to $100,000 a year as a base salary. So that being said, we know the names of the officers. We know this. And they've created a Twitter bot where you can type in an officer, say an officer harasses you, stops and frisks you, harasses your son, tases somebody in your community. You can actually find out how bad that officer is. Now, that could be extremely useful, but why not just go after some of the worst here? Why do we need the algorithm? We know who it is. We know their names. They go home to their families every day and seem to hold their head up high. What say you, Sam?
Yeah, so I would say that, yeah, I mean, it is a tough question. And I think what you're speaking to is the complexity of this issue, right? I don't think that there's like a magic silver bullet or like magic solution that will just deal with all of this, right? It is both about, one, we recognize that there are these officers that like make up a disproportionate share of use of force and the bad outcomes that we don't like, right? And we also recognize that like the system as a whole is problematic, is contributing to worsening this problem, reinforcing and frankly promoting those officers oftentimes, and engaging in wildly discriminatory practices where even the officers who are not the worst officers are still like pretty bad. So, and like that all exists, and exposing those officers and exposing those systems alone isn't like the work, right? Like that is step one of the work. Step two is using that data to remove those officers and to fundamentally transform those practices, right? I think like we often spend time focusing on like the awareness piece of this because so much of the work necessarily up to this point has been like convincing mayors or city council members or like the country at large if this is a crisis to pay attention to. I think that goal has been largely achieved, right? I think people get that this is a problem now in general. So it's not so much that the work here that the data does is exposing that there's a problem. I think people get it. It's more so about thinking about if we were going to intervene in a city like Chicago. Now we understand these are the officers. We can better understand the systems that allow these officers to continue being employed. And you mentioned the officer who's the police union president. So let's talk about the police unions. And this is, this also goes to the democratic input piece. People assume that like the mayor or the police chief has sort of the unfettered discretion to change things. And they don't. And the reality is in cities, like in most cities, the police union actually calls the shots. The police union, through negotiating collective bargaining agreement, police union contracts with cities, they basically behind closed doors every 4 to 5 years negotiate contracts that structure the entire accountability system of a police department. Those negotiations are, they're in secret. There's no community representation at the table. The city lawyer, the police union lawyers, most up until maybe the past year, those meetings, most organizers, like that wasn't like top of my priority to like be in those meetings, to get access to those meetings, to use that strategy as a way to change these systems. Now I think there's some awareness building around that, but here's what that means. So in cities like Chicago, if an officer, let's say you have a police chief that actually wants to hold these officers accountable who have these worst records. There are a couple ways that they could do that. One is they fire them, right, for the next incident. Or they could potentially think about maybe they want to downsize the police department and remove the officers with the worst records in the context of a layoff. Those are like two decisions they can make to remove those officers. Now, if they made the first decision and fired the officer in cities like Chicago, the officer, because of the police union contract and that negotiation process, they have the right to appeal that through arbitration. That means that the police union gets to play a role in selecting an arbitrator who hears that case, that disciplinary case, and has full authority to reinstate the officer plus back pay, regardless of whether the chief wanted them fired. So you look in a city like San Antonio, more than 70% of all the officers fired for misconduct by the police chief are rehired, are forced to be rehired because of that process. More than 70% of the officers. So if you have a circumstance where, and it's like that in a lot of cities, in Philadelphia, it's more than 50%, DC is 45% of the officers, et cetera. So if you have an environment where even in the small number of cases where the police chief or the community oversight structure, if it has the power in cities like San Francisco and Oakland, it does, can fire the officer, hold them accountable in these instances. It doesn't matter because the majority of those cases just end up being reversed on this layer of appeal mandated by the police union contract. So what that means is like the final disciplinary authority in most cities to decide whether an officer stays or goes is not the police chief, it's not the mayor, it's not the community oversight structure. It is this arbitrator who is selected in part by the police union and empowered through the police union contract to have full authority to reverse any disciplinary decision. And like that is a complicated structure, and that is how policing is structured in most cities in this country. And like this is probably news to some people on the call, right, or on the webinar, right? Like this isn't well known, and yet like that's the structure. So like yes, we need to expose the officers. That's important. But like, we also need to change all of these systems that prevent them from being held accountable. One, like, yes, you need a police chief or an oversight structure, preferably, that can actually discipline officers and hold them directly accountable, independently investigate them, et cetera. And you need to address the police union contract, which wipes away those powers or precludes those structures from having the final decision. And in addition to that, right, we talk about the second route, the layoff route. In the Chicago police union contract, it says layoffs have to happen in order of seniority. So let's say they cut the police budget, which, you know, Lori Lightfoot has said she doesn't want to do in Chicago. But let's say the activists win, right? Like they get a cut. And it's let's say a 20% cut to the police budget, which would be major. That cut would probably result in some layoffs, since most of the police budget is officer pay and benefits. Those layoffs would have to be in order of seniority. So they couldn't even remove, in fact, the officers with the worst records are the most senior officers. Like they've been around for a while. So they're staying. Like you're removing the younger officers, Black and brown officers disproportionately, officers without records. Like that's who gets removed in the context of reducing the police budget inside of the force. And that's because of the contract. Like that's not, it doesn't have to be that way.
I will say that the city, so for instance, the city though does pay about 153 million per year in misconduct settlements. And they vote for that budget. So I think, you know, again, the question is, where is the political will to say we will not pay for their misconduct or their violence? I mean, again, I would say that we should put, you know, we shouldn't have to put a price tag on human life. But since we're talking about this is a really expensive, what you're describing is a really expensive taxpayer, you know, undertaking that right now at a time where Chicago public schools aren't even open, we're paying $153 million per year and it keeps going up every year. They allocate more every year in anticipation of the misconduct, which to me blows my mind. So I don't know, to the Rachel's point though, about, is it dangerous to criticize predictive policing when it's used so violently against communities of color, but then to use it the other direction? Do you feel that there's any kind of backfire?
Yeah, there's a conflict.
Does it legitimize the procedure that we just said can be very biased?
I think the procedure is already happening, right? The question is, do we use the data against the police or not? And I think we have to. Like, yes. Like, I think like this often gets like theoretical and philosophical. I'm like very practical. If we can use this to hold the officers accountable, I think we should. And that's just, in this circumstance, it makes sense. And they've been weaponizing this against us the entire time. Like, I don't think me using this algorithm is going to be what legitimizes it. Like they are.
I'm not insinuating. It's more of it's a larger, you know, it's just a larger issue, just in general because I think the issue about the culture of policing, we know what that culture is. And we could show it quantitatively in clusters as you had it. There's a bunch of different ways to do that, but we can also name the officers in addition to that work. And that's what I was saying. I think Brittany Friedman is a scholar and she that studies prisons. And she says, we often talk about racist consequences. We don't talk about racist intentions. So when we want to say there is racist violence, we can point to actual people doing it, right? Like that, there's that part of it too. We're focused on the big picture, but maybe not those who have the intentions and the actions as well. Yeah.
Oh, I guess just to add on, this was something we struggled with as well, was how do we feel, where do we land on using predictive algorithms on police behavior? And I think there is, regardless of what you think about what the advisability of that, there is one really important distinction, where as much as we criticize it when it's used by law enforcement, turning it back on law enforcement, it's not the same. Even if there are similar issues as are common to all algorithmic policing, all predictive algorithms, regardless of the context, you cannot ignore the fact that the power dynamics only go in one direction. And so when it comes to analyzing the situation, I think it matters that whether or not the person who is using the algorithm versus the person it's being deployed on has the power to enforce state violence, for example. Are they punching up or are they punching down? And I think that just makes such a huge difference that we can't really engage in honest analysis without facing that power differential head on. And then speaking to the other things that you were saying about looking at individualized police officers and intent, I think the first thing is that it's really, we have to be really careful not to place too much emphasis on intent, because so much racism and so much oppression happens without intent at all. In fact, a lot of it is designed to happen without intent or people even realizing. And so In Canadian equality law, for example, equality and non-discrimination law, we're not allowed, or sorry, the courts and regulators aren't allowed to take intent into consideration when it comes to discrimination, because to recognize, and substantive equality is another one too. And this is one of the huge problems when it comes with algorithmic policing, is that algorithms by nature are mathematical, right? That's a form of formal equality where you just give everyone the same treatment. That's a very simplistic view of what equal treatment means, right? Mm-hmm. But again, in Canadian constitutional law, anyway, you have to have substantive equality, which means not treating everyone the same. It means treating people differently because they live in different contexts and exist in different relationships to the state and to each other, to privatized individuals. And so I think this goes a bit to what Samuel was saying earlier, and is also why I really love Rachel N's question, because in some ways, looking at technology is a red herring. Like, I feel like with every one of these panels, they always end up in a place where I say something like, even though this is about technology, like our panels, our research is about technology, it's really not about the technology at all. And if we're not careful, policing technology becomes a red herring, because for people who are pro-policing technology, it becomes a way to, so, we've seen, for example, how people have said, oh, well, these algorithms that will remove police bias because algorithms aren't biased like people are. And then that removes the emphasis to look behind the bias and to why it's there in the first place. So the same way that looking at individual police officers individualizes a problem that really is a systemic and institutional problem and has to be treated that way, a similar dynamic happens when it comes with technology. We look at the specific tool that they're using. So now it's facial recognition and predictive policing. But 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was carding. 10 years ago, it was notebooks. 20 years from now, it'll be another technology, and we'll all be talking about that. But the underlying issues will still be exactly the same. I mean, hopefully not, but being realistic. And so I think that's the important thing that people have to realize, is that even though we're talking about the technology, it's not about the technology, because it's about why is there so much policing in the first place? And that goes to that earlier discussion about over-policing versus under-policing, where why is it that when you can criminalize a community, they are over-policed, but when you can help them and when they themselves are the victims of crime and violence, they are not helped. And so I think it's really a matter of not taking that techno-solutionist approach where everything can be solved by technology, but looking beyond that to showing what are the problems in the first place. And those problems are affordable housing and poverty and education and racism. And so that's what we have to look at. And those problems aren't algorithmic problems or technology problems, they're political problems.
That is such a great point. This, I was rereading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, and he actually says the same exact thing, right? He's talking about police hunting people in the convict lease system. And yet his recommendations are the same then at the turn of the century as we're talking right now. We know the solutions, but we continue to, regardless of the technology and the means of how we do it, it seems to keep replicating itself. We are at like the 5-minute mark. So I'm going to do like lightning round questions sometimes. Okay, so here we go, lightning round. Miss Irene Helen Wu would like to know, what are some examples of tech products that have been created that actively create positive change in regards to police violence and mass incarceration or others to empower people of color broadly? Anybody want to take that?
I just have one example. It's called Appalition, APP-alition, and it's a place to kind of mutual aid for bail. So it collects money and it gives cash bail to people, and then it collects it back and recycles through the system. And that's just one really good example of how we can start advancing an abolitionist viewpoint.
So here's another one. The person, it just has some initials here, J. Paula. It said, would expanding this lens to include child welfare be valuable? The predictive analytics being proposed in the child welfare field are now, as we have seem to intersect with this policing data collection and data analysis, even the data collection and the DNA collection in some treatment areas in quotes, are very similar. Can this possibly contribute to the law enforcement policing data and disproportionate response? Wow, child welfare intersects with criminal justice. Does anybody know about that?
I can maybe just give some links and resources for the person to look more into, because I think it's true, even though we're all focused on the policing and criminal justice context, there is a whole other slew of algorithms and body of literature to do with the civil context, whether it's child welfare or housing, or teaching or hiring algorithms, and all the same issues apply in these other areas of life as well. So I think the starting point would be Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality. She has a whole chapter, if not more, specifically on child welfare algorithms, as well as in teaching algorithms, hiring algorithms. So all of the she talks about criminal justice as well, but she also has many chapters on where algorithms are being deployed in these ways to make decisions impacting people's lives outside of the criminal justice context. And more to that, there's been some really interesting developments outside of North America. So for example, I think in the Netherlands, they actually recently had a landmark court ruling saying that a fraud detection algorithm was illegal, and they ended up banning it.
Mm-hmm. So another question from Maureen for Samuel. Can you speak to the 8 Can't Wait data inaccuracies, please? That is a quick one.
Yeah, so 8 Can't Wait was an initiative to restrict police use of force policies across the country, and obviously became really controversial last year. So just to level set, the campaign is based on a host of academic research going back 4 decades now. Starting with criminologist John Fife, all the way back who studied the NYPD in the 70s. And essentially what that research consistently shows every time that the research is done, and it's been done so many times, including one of my studies, was that the cities that have more restrictive policies on police use of force have lower rates of police shootings in general, and particularly killings by police. And this isn't rocket science, why this would be. It is, the places that ban officers from doing things like shooting at people in vehicles, which has been recommended to be banned by the Department of Justice for a very long time, that those police departments are less likely to use force in those situations, and therefore there are lower rates of fatal police violence. I think that there was a lot of critique around how do we know that this is true? Is that causal? No, it's not, because it's very hard to actually track the implementation of policy in a city. There's not a randomized control trial where some of the department is implementing a certain restriction and the rest of the department is not. Also, the policies change frequently within cities. So, use of force policy tends to be revised every 3 or 4 years. So even just tracking this in multiple places across the country is extremely difficult. That being said, this is one of the areas, I started by saying there's very little data on the policing. There wasn't very much in 2013, 14. Even now, there's little. This is one of the areas that has been studied more extensively than others. The research consistently finds places with more restrictive policies on use of force. The police are less likely to kill people. So 8 Can't Wait was basically taking those recommendations from that body of research, translating them into a really easy to understand sort of set of recommendations for use of force specifically. And to date, we've tracked over 340 cities that have implemented more restrictive policies after that. So I think that's one of the largest and most sweeping restrictions on police use of force policies in recent history. It doesn't solve all of the problems, but what it does do is it sets up a set of really clearly defined rules that can allow for officers to be held accountable where otherwise it would have been impossible. So if you can't prove that the officer violated this rule in the policy, you can't fire the officer. That's not how it works, right? You have to prove that they violated the use of force policy in this section. Therefore, based on the disciplinary matrix, you can discipline them in this way. What we found when we did the study of cities' use of force policies of the 100 largest cities, which is the most extensive study of use of force policies to date, was that most cities didn't have all of those restrictions in place. In fact, most cities had fewer than half of the 8 in place. And so they just didn't have these rules that would even allow for the officers to be disciplined in the first place. So the idea behind the initiative was to create these clear lines in the sand so the officers could be held accountable. Step 2 is addressing the accountability system and police union issues that I talked about so that you can enforce those rules. But I do think a lot of the critiques are fair, that I think obviously this isn't going to overnight end all police violence. It is a harm reduction strategy that the research suggests can save lives. And so we'll see how those dynamics change in the data now that we've seen so many departments implement it.
Thank you so much. We'll have to end on that question and that answer. Thank you. I just want to thank all the panelists. Thank you for your work. Thank you, Cynthia and Cierra and Samuel. And thank you to the organizers on this series, Technology and the Structural Inequality series, hosted by CSREA in collaboration with the Department of Computer Science. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.